Hello and welcome everyone. My name is David Lantigua. I am an associate professor here in theology, a Kellogg fellow, and also the co-director of the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism. It's my delight and privilege to moderate this panel today, which is really commemorating. It's a book launch session, something that is very felicitous and exciting in that this is something that came out of the time that we were during the pandemic and unable to have a Romero conference like the one we're having now. And so this is really the fruit of that time and interacting over Zoom. There's a positive fruit from Zoom. And it was just an extraordinary opportunity that our editor and really chief organizer for this entire conference, Todd Walatka, my colleague in theology, was able to do through just extensive work and putting together such a wonderful volume that really allows us to see and encounter Romero through the lens of the church's social doctrine and as a doctor of the church. I think that's something that we see, we'll talk about here in the course of this conversation. I think one of the things that really stands out about Romero in thinking about him as a doctor of the church and his working with the church's social tradition is that he's not just receiving the tradition. I think that's something that whenever we talk about Vatican II, there's the talk about reception of the Second Vatican Council or the reception of church social teaching. Romero, and to use here, I like the language that Father Gustavo Gutierrez provided, going back to the beginning of the question of liberation theology, really rereads the doctrine of the church in view of his Salvadorian context. And I think that just really yields a rich analysis that we don't often find in the lived experience of the church's social doctrine. So what we're going to do here is just go through, I'm going to briefly introduce our first speaker. We have three up here who are all contributors to the volume. Oh, sorry.
I'm sort of objective outside.
Yeah. Well, you've been involved in the conversations in such a way that I almost consider you now part of the volume. But we'll begin with first Meghan Clark, who's a professor of moral theology at St. John's University, New York. She's an expert in CST, has written extensively on it, and particularly the concept of solidarity, which she'll be talking about. She's the author of Vision of Catholic Social Thought, The Virtue of Solidarity and the Praxis of Human Rights, which is published by Fortress Press. She's also co-editor of Public Theology and the Global Common Good, the contribution of David Hollenbach. And in 2022, she was assistant coordinator for North America's Doing Theology from the Existential Peripheries, which is a global theology project of the migrant and refugee section of the Holy See's Dicastery for Integral Human Development. She's a senior fellow at St. John's Vincentian Center for Church and Society, and she currently serves as faculty expert for the Holy See's mission to the United Nations. So we'll begin with her.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you to everyone who's here. I want to begin and express my gratitude to Todd and the University of Notre Dame for this project. It has been a profound privilege to be part of this project. And as we launch the book, in my brief time today, I want to just focus on three things. A bit on the collaborative process that led to the book, a note on why I think that the book and kind of this question of the future of Romero studies is particularly important from the perspective of Catholic social teaching. And then a little bit finally on what it is that I contributed to the book on incarnational solidarity in Romero and Pope Francis. So this book and collaboration, as David said, we spent a lot of time on Zoom. And it was one of the more fun experiences spent on Zoom during the pandemic. I must confess that when I received the invitation to be part of the project in 2020, right, as we're all in the midst of COVID and in lockdowns of various kinds, I was both honored and massively intimidated. I hadn't spent as much time with Romero's homilies as most everyone else in this volume, many of whom are, their books on Romero can be found out on the table out there. But what I found was a community that was just a lot of fun to be part of. It was incredibly supportive. It created a community and is a product of a community. We met over Zoomed, workshopped, and discussed drafts. And in my case, multiple people, as I was trying to track things down, again, with a massive kind of language penalty of not speaking and reading Spanish, everybody was incredibly gracious in order to help me find where I could find this homily that didn't seem to be in other places in English and things like that. Through it all, Todd was incredibly supportive and patient editor. Again, editing a book during a global pandemic with a bunch of scholars is not an easy task for it to come out and come out as well as it did. So I am really grateful to be here with you all today. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that producing this chapter has been illuminating, not just as I thought about Catholic social teaching and thought about, in particular, thinking about Romero and our current Pope Francis. It was helpful in ways I hadn't expected in terms of seeing kind of new connections. But it ended up being revelatory and illuminating for other things I'm working on, and that places where I see the need for Catholic social teaching to develop even further, as well as honestly being good for the soul. I have to say, and this has come up already a little bit this morning, that sitting with Romero's homilies made it a little bit easier to find hope in this particular moment that we are living through here in the United States in particular. And so, yeah, I'm really glad for everybody else to get to see kind of the fruits of all of our labor, but also to kind of see something that even as we were working on it during because of the pandemic was itself fraught in unique ways. The persistence of everybody that was involved to stick with it and to be able to be here today. Why do I think this book is important? There's a risk when somebody known for their prophetic witness is canonized, a risk of simplifying and sanitizing their legacy to lessen its radical edge. And this is not only just the case when we're talking about official canonization in the US context in terms of popular roles. You can see this with the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as well, right? When someone is known for a prophetic witness that carries with it an edge, particularly one that challenges existing economic power structures, there's a real risk of oversimplifying and sanitizing what it is that they said and did. In Romero's case, there's an additional risk and vulnerability in trying to grapple with a complicated history within a complicated church. And so how do you address and grapple with his own complicated personal narrative over the course of his life and ministry, as we've also talked about this morning? All of the authors in this book sought to engage his witness and memory in its complexity, nuance, and with its prophetic edge. Michael Lee notes that Romero's relationship to liberation theology is complicated, as was his own interpretation of Catholic social teaching in his chapter, and that a profound change occurred that made it possible in his ministry as archbishop. In his chapter, Lee argues that Romero's shift on both the importance of Catholic social teaching and liberation theology together made possible this transformation. A key outcome of this transformation later in the book, David Lantigua notes, is that, quote, recognizing the face of Christ in the campesinos of El Salvador victims of historical wrongs and current injustices, demands love that builds up God's people through the restoration of dignity and struggling for the truth and goodness of justice. This was an extraordinary and a dangerous claim by an ecclesiastical leader. In 1979, Romero himself wrote, "My position as a pastor obliges me to solidarity with everyone who suffers and to embody every effort for human freedom and dignity." So throughout this volume, we all tried to take that prophetic edge we see in Romero, address it, analyze it, but leaving it in its complexity and its edge. We've all actively sought to avoid just stopping at his living witness and lift out his theological contribution. Liz Gandolfo concludes her chapter with a question that I think ultimately, at least for me, is the question of the book itself. And that is that Romero challenges us to think more deeply about, quote, when it comes to our own time and place, what can we learn from Romero's theological reflections on and solidarity with the people in general and the people of God in El Salvador? Now, as was noted, my own area of expertise is specifically the Catholic social teaching side of things. And on this, I want to highlight the importance of this book for those doing Catholic social teaching within Euro-American or English-speaking circles. And a lot of this, right, European and American Catholic social teaching is largely published and talked about and conducted in English, and not just within the US. For far too long, Óscar Romero has been held up as a martyr and witness to CST without much attribution to his own theological contribution to it. The book is the first of its kind, and I don't want to brush past this, right? Because I'm sitting here and it is self-criticism of kind of where I sit in the academy, that in 2025, this shouldn't be the first of this kind of look from Catholic social teaching at the contribution of Romero. And as I read his homilies and pastorals, I encountered an archbishop unlike I certainly have ever heard preach. And I'm not talking about his radical identification with the poor here. I'm talking about his pastoral preaching and catechesis of social teaching from the pulpit. The depth and attention to catechizing on Vatican II and the social encyclicals is striking to read in a context where Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti rarely find mention on the USCCB's agenda, and almost even rarer from the pulpit or as part of a systemic catechesis program aimed across the entire country. Without sidetracking us into the politics of previous papal dynamics around liberation theology or the politics of canonization, this book is an incredibly important contribution to Catholic social thought, arguing for Romero as a major voice in its theological development and pastoral application, and not just the fact of his witness and martyrdom as a witness rather than as a shaper of the tradition. And this is revelatory of and one part of a greater need for the US church to pay more attention to the Latin American church and to theology done in and by Spanish-speaking communities within North America, in Canada, and the United States. As this book was finishing the editing process, I began working on another collaborative project, and this part of these big projects on Vatican II. And so a volume on Gaudium et Spes, in which I'm tasked with doing the exegetical commentary on just the economic justice paragraphs. And that led me to looking at the role that Helder Camara from Brazil had on Gaudium et Spes as yet another example where the experience of the poor in Latin America featured prominently in developing of Catholic social teaching, but that is often glossed over, right? And that is, if you look at paragraph 71 in Gaudium et Spes, which talks about land reform and farm workers. The integration of Gaudium et Spes of Medellin and Puebla on justice for the poor and land reform is, Matthew Whalen has a book that looks at that in detail, as well as his chapter here, in which we can see Romero's view of property does not consist in only producing more, but within reference always to the common good. These connections have not received sufficient attention within Catholic social thought done in the United States and Europe, which has spent much of its time focused around geopolitical dynamics that are more east and west than north and south. And we're at a moment where I think we risk that going back to being the case in terms of politics, and we need to resist it even more strongly, but where the experience of the synod and synod conversation shows us just how much the North American church has to learn from the Latin American church. And the synod has really shown that in extensive detail. So finally, a little bit on what I contributed to the chapter, to the book, my chapter, which was on incarnational solidarity. So my chapter examines the development of solidarity in CST, the CST known to Romero. So focusing on Vatican II, John the 23rd, and Paul VI, and then proposes Romero as living and developing a deeply incarnational solidarity in his own application of CST. And then turns to how these Christological dimensions of solidarity emphasized and lived out by Romero continue to be developed by Pope Francis. Incarnational solidarity, as I identify it, looks at Jesus as the model of solidarity and solidarity with the marginalized as a place of encounter with Christ. For Romero and the tradition at the time, an integrated ethic of solidarity called for particular attention to mission and evangelization. Living witness to the gospel was emphasized as central to social initiative of preaching the gospel. For Romero, the understanding of solidarity envisioned included his reflection on and preaching on Evangelii Nuntiandi, and this had a profound influence on his social ministry. Solidarity with the people and with the gospel clearly shaped the way he received and taught CST as archbishop, for whom, above all, the gospel must be proclaimed by witnesses. This gets developed after his death by John Paul II into the statement and the attribution of solidarity as a virtue and as a distinctively Christian virtue, in which Solicitudo Rei Socialis defined solidarity helps us see the other, whether a person, people, or nation, not just as some kind of instrument with a work capacity and physical strength to be exploited at low cost and then discarded when no longer useful, but as our neighbor. It is easy to imagine what from the 1987 encyclical would have made it into the footnotes of Romero's homilies, but for his martyrdom. A brief note on how this then gets developed by Francis. And here too, we can see here not only consistency with earlier Catholic social thought, but a deep resonance to what we find in the homilies of Romero. Speaking among the poor in Paraguay, Francis implored, a faith that does not draw us into solidarity is a faith which is deceitful. A faith without solidarity is a faith without Christ. With this stark, simple, and strong statement, Francis placed the incarnation at the very center of his theological ethic of solidarity. We are all part of each other, and my humanity is bound up in yours, but it is also bound up in Christ. Exclusion of the poor is literally the exclusion of Christ. What my chapter tries to do in more detail is look at the way Pope Francis's teaching on incarnational solidarity illuminates the way Romero himself both modeled the CST of his day and influenced that which would come after him. Just to give you a little sense of what it is that I did in this chapter, and sees Romero as receiving, teaching, and developing solidarity as he received it from Vatican II and Paul VI, and then Francis as very much picking up not only of that as it was taught by his papal predecessors, but the image that you get of the centrality of Christ and an truly incarnational solidarity that comes from Romero as well, or at least as far as I contend comes and is consistent with Romero as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Meghan Clark. One of the tributes to the social teaching of the church is that it is able to, or should be able to, stimulate interdisciplinary conversation. And so it's really a joy to have the following two speakers who come to us and speak out of not the context of theology specifically, but other disciplines. And so now I turn to Kevin Coleman, who's Associate Professor of History at the University of Toronto. He's the author of A Camera in the Garden of Eden, The Self-Forging of a Banana Republic, published in 2016. He directed and wrote Stolen Photo, a documentary film co-produced by Señal Colombia and supported by the National Film Board of Canada. He's co-editor of Capitalism and the Camera, which was published by Verso Press in 2021, and has also been translated into Chinese. I'm not trying to pronounce that. And Coup d'etat in Cold War Latin America, which is published by Cambridge Press. His research has been funded by the Andrew Mellon Foundation and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, and he has been awarded prizes from the American Historical Association and the Canadian Historical Association. He's currently writing a book on Romero.
Thanks, David.
Sure.
Thanks so much. So thank you to Todd for the gift of this book and for the invitation to comment on it. This book is a tremendous gift to all of us and to future scholars of Romero and Catholic social teaching. My task today, I think, was to provide a sort of critical overview of the book. I'm not a contributor to it, so I'm coming at this from the outside, and perhaps the invitation was to suggest possible avenues for further research. So many edited volumes fail to cohere around a single theme and instead offer a cacophony of individual takes on a particular topic. Not so with this book. Todd Walatka has managed to bring together various perspectives on the same subject. With this book and with this gathering, Todd reminds us of the magic that can happen when great minds collaborate, producing insights on a topic that no single person could have developed on their own. I want to register a minor disagreement with Todd. In the introduction, he writes, and indeed there are many excellent biographies of Romero that clearly note his regular use of Catholic social teaching as archbishop. However, despite these positive receptions of Romero, there are far fewer examples of deep theological engagement with Romero as a thinker worthy of substantive analysis and critique. By my count, there are only two really rigorous, archivally driven biographies. There are other biographies that do slices here and there of his life. But as I think this gathering demonstrates, a lot of the discussion is among theologians, by theologians, and historians. We have loads to learn from a book like this. And I invite other historians, people from fields other than theology, to engage with the inspiring and radical thought that's contained in this book. The most successful moments in the book occur when theologians, I think, are thinking historically and when they use historical methods. I'm not sure to what degree historians can think theologically, but it's clear that theologians can think historically. Todd pushes us to attempt a deeper understanding of the way Romero read Catholic social teaching among his contemporaries and what that had to do with his transformation. Todd is, in other words, pressing us to ask historical, biographical questions about Romero's growth and his changing understanding of how his faith compelled him to see, judge, and act differently. So the first theme I want to focus on is that of moral imagination. In the conclusion to the book, Peter Casarella, he writes, Romero's subversive words and acts have everything to do with an ossified matrix of economics, power, and culture that enforced a certain kind of regulation of the senses on the Salvadoran people. Thus, Romero's task consisted in bringing to light the wounding of the colonial bodies that he had seen with his own eyes and that were being buried or hidden from the imaginations of the Salvadoran people. Romero's decolonial aesthesis was a decolonial poetics, a form of remaking the Christian imagination. It's a powerful formulation there from Casarella. I hear hints of Jacques Rancière and his book Disagreement and the other book, The Politics of the Aesthetics. In fact, I don't know if it's just me, but I felt there was a lot of that in different essays in this book. Kevin Burke, in his chapter, hints at how looking back on Romero's pastoral leadership from our present illumines previously underappreciated aspects of his witness. Romero helps us remember, Burke writes, that untruth kills, that a lie is an act of violence, and that a culture of disinformation and accusations of fake news is a culture of death. The dynamic interaction between violence and disinformation played out over and over in El Salvador, both to prepare the way for violent attacks before they happened and to cover them up afterward. So if we ask ourselves, why Romero, why now? I think we've got an answer. In his biography of Rutilio Grande, Father Rodolfo Cardenal, I don't see him now, but he thematizes this dynamic. But unfortunately, neither Brockman nor Morozzo attended to it with the same rigor. Our Trumpian present compels us, I think, to re-examine how lies pave the way for violence. Another theme then in this book is that conflict engendered by correctly applying Catholic social teaching to Salvadoran realities was the engine of Romero's transformation, and Michael Lee makes this argument quite powerfully. There's this other theme that recurs across various chapters of concientización, and I don't know if it's too much of a stretch, but for me, this whole process was another redistributing of the sensible, of what could be seen, said, and done in El Salvador at that moment. We get it in other ways from David's article on dignity. I'll get to that later. Lee tracks Romero's changing relationship to liberation theology from the early 1970s to the last 5 years of his life, and then distills this into a dynamic that served as the motor force of Romero's growth and of the very emergence of Salvadoran liberation theology. And just to register, we don't get a static Romero in Lee's account here, and from other people who've contributed. And I think there is a risk of sometimes a rendering of Romero as only adapting to changing circumstances. But here we get a Romero who's changing. Anyway, to quote Lee on liberation theology emerged in El Salvador when Christians, in part inspired by Catholic social teaching, engaged in concientización and empowerment projects that illumined structural inequalities, awakened political opposition, this is crucial, and drew violent repression, Critical reflection on this process and reality led to the theological reimagining that we call liberation theology. In Romero's very person, we see the deep divisions in the Catholic Church of the early 1970s revealed as it grappled with issues of global poverty and the legacy of colonialism. Here, Lee's explanation is, in my view, far more compelling than Morozzo's, which ultimately rested on the claim that Romero's change was not really a change at all, but was rather due to the greater responsibilities that he took on when he became archbishop. Lee, in contrast, locates Romero's transformation in his changed view of the state, in having to confront the reality of repression. Lee writes, repressive violence served as a catalyst for Romero's political disillusionment. Putting his finger on this dynamic of interior growth, Lee later writes, quote, it was precisely out of conflicts that the profound transformation in Romero's character in ministry took place. Matthew Wellen, in his chapter, he tracks Romero's changing views on conflicts over access to land for farming. And his book has been hugely inspirational to me, but I think it's also been very inspirational to many of the authors, many of the contributors to this volume, where he makes, in Blood in the Fields, he makes this argument that the theological grammar of creation gives rise to a politics of common use. And in Welland's chapter, we get a Romero who does change, whose thinking develops. He tracks Romero's enthusiastic support for the CIA-backed coup that overthrew Arbenz in 1954, based primarily on his opposition to Decree 900, the land reform law. You know the details. And Romero bought in to this characterization of it as a communist plot, rather than a problem of land tenure, the unequal distribution of land within Guatemala. By 1979, Romero is arguing the exact opposite. And here again, a lesson for us. If we want to, Romero, he changed his mind. And thank goodness he did. He argued in 79 in one of his homilies, quote, land reform is a theological necessity. That is change that we have to explain, right? From 54, thinking it's just a communist plot, to 79, calling it a theological necessity. Welland's explanation for Romero's transformation, like Lee's, locates it in the conflict generated by attempting to apply Catholic social teaching to the reality of a landless peasantry. Welland shows how Romero's understanding and embrace of Catholic social teaching grew, quote, as he faced increasingly hostile opposition that associated Catholic social teaching with communism. And this, I think Welland and Lee are right in their explanations of what drove, in part, what drove Romero's changing thought. This revised understanding of Romero's transformation also changes how we understand the meaning of Romero's martyrdom, which Welland points out by quoting Pope Francis, was not simply for having confessed the creed, but for having done the works which Jesus commands with regard to one's neighbor. All right. A third theme that comes out in this book is this idea that you've heard a bit from, you've heard from Meghan Clark today, that solidarity is political, right? And Clark takes us back to Pasamenteres, 1963. Solidarity, she writes, is inescapably political. She quotes John the 23rd to make this point. Solidarity, he wrote, means recognizing that all political authority exists to fulfill the common good of the whole human family, end quote. Liz O'Donnell's Gandolfo, ethnographic and theological investigation in CEBs, Christian-based communities, gives us a sense for how this solidarity developed on the ground and how it helped to shape Romero, whose response to the Christian-based communities, she writes, was one of, quote, humble listening and growth, end quote. Here again, I'm thinking of Casarella's conclusion in other chapters. There's almost as if Romero, and in this case, and I think if I understand your argument correctly, it's the Christian-based communities are now sort of redistributing the sensible, redistributing what can be seen, said, and done in El Salvador at that time. First, she writes, and this isn't a quote, but this is her argument. First, Christian-based communities name themselves as pobre. Second, they come together in solidarity. Third, this self-understanding and praxis of solidarity impels Christian-based communities, quote, to stand in solidarity with the Salvadoran people in particular, and other marginalized peoples more broadly, by virtue of their social and ecclesial identity. They are sent by God to activate their own historical agency and act as leaven in the midst of the struggles of their pueblo. Given the century we're in, and especially in this moment, I'm starting to worry even when I use the word the people now. Because we're in this populist moment where it cuts both ways. And the term the people can bind us together as a national community or as members of the same human family, but it can also be used to divide us as those who are discursively part of a given community and those who are not. And there's an unmistakably populist logic to the use of the Salvadoran people, even by Christian-based communities. And so when Trump uses the people, or when Perón used it, let's say, it is a people versus the elites in both cases. That's just Ernesto Laclau's classic definition of populism. That renders the elite as not part of the people. Hence, I wonder if this logic plays a central role in creating the ideological conditions for civil war, or at least continuing polarization. This is not a critique of the chapter. It's the Christian-based communities and we ourselves use this language of the people and how easily it can be used for other purposes. David Lantigua's investigation, I should have had a smoother transition, but David Lantigua's investigation of the distinctively Latin American contributions to global human rights theology, discourse, and law. It's this is really, he's taking up Samuel Moyne's remark and book on papal recognition of human rights by Pius XII in his Christmas message. But then Lantigua offers us a useful corrective to Moyne, because Moyne and his student James Chappell focus on the European origins of this universal notion of human dignity. But Lantigua focuses on Salam's emphasis on injustice and institutionalized violence. He writes of a growing, quote, theological awareness of this challenge of the non-person for the church. Here again, I'm sorry that I'm bringing this lens, I'm reading it through Rancière, but I could not help but think of the part that has no part, the non-person. This is Lantigua, theological awareness of this challenge of the non-person for the church, recognizing the dignity of the non-person. Lantigua quotes Paul VI to campesinos in Medellin, quote, you are a sign, an image, a mystery of the presence of Christ. Campesinos, that is, to translate it into Rancierian terms, are the part that has no part. And through disagreement, declares itself a part of the community. Now, I think a tension within the volume between two incompatible views. in these very important chapters by Rosario Rodriguez, who's not here, I think. It's a shame. I wish he were here. This would be great. And José Henríquez Leiva, we have two fundamentally incompatible readings of Romero's position on revolutionary violence. I wish that Todd and Peter had explicitly dealt with that in the introduction and the conclusion, because it's really, I think, something we all have to wrestle with. Because doing so, both of their readings are very sophisticated, subtle, nuanced. I'm going to simplify them here, but both of them, you can be persuaded by either of their readings. But here they are. But in clarifying this difference, we come to terms with Romero's thinking, but also critically reevaluate his theological position and pastoral teachings. According to Rosario Rodriguez, Romero's, quote, pastoral letters attempted to make room for revolutionary violence within the Christian worldview, end quote. He continues, quote, Romero argued for an ethical form of insurrectional violence, end quote. Rosario Rodriguez then works through Black liberationist theologian James Cone's endorsement of revolutionary violence. But now, according to Henríquez Leiva, Romero, quote, pushed forward a non-violent moral imagination to transcend violence, end quote. Henríquez Leiva continues, quote, the reference to just war principles in Romero's 1978 pastoral letter, Church and Popular Political Organizations, quote, could lead to the argument that Romero was becoming inclined to accept an armed solution to the state violence of El Salvador, particularly considering that neighboring Nicaragua was already in the middle of a revolutionary war. I'm still quoting José. However, the letter does not point in that direction. Indeed, Romero and Rivera affirm that, and now they quote the pastoral letter, the church prefers the constructive dynamism of nonviolence, end quote. Now I'll go back to quoting José. So we have, I think, oh no, this is myself, sorry. Finally. So we have, that was 20 minutes. Can I have a few more minutes? Sure. I Leo Guardado's chapters here too. I want to, but this disagreement, all right? So we have two very different readings of Romero's position on revolutionary violence. At the end of his chapter, Rosario Rodriguez reconsiders this question in light of Pope Francis's Fratelli Tutti, where Francis writes that, quote, war is a failure of politics and of humanity, a shameful capitulation, a stinging defeat before the forces of evil, end quote. Rosario Rodriguez then wonders if Francis's teaching is that the time for just war theory has passed. So who's right, Ruben or José? And what's at stake in the disagreement that is not explicitly thematized in the framing of the book? In my view, Ruben is right that Romero did in fact carve out the possibility for a just use of revolutionary violence. But I really wish that José was right. As I read Romero, the position that José outlines for him is the one that he should have taken, but didn't. With the examples of nonviolent, that is, Romero should have taken, not José. The position that Romero should have taken, but did not. With the examples of nonviolent civil disobedience bequeathed to us by Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi, Romero had an alternative to choose from. He could have accelerated the development of Catholic social teaching on this issue, but didn't. He could have gotten us decades earlier to where Francis seems to have landed us today. The reasons for what we call what we might call, or maybe just I might call, Romero's failure of moral imagination on this front are, as I think José suggests, the positive example of a successful revolution to overthrow the Somoza dictatorship in Nicaragua. See, José slipped in that Nicaragua thing, and he's absolutely right, I think, that intuition. Romero publishes this pastoral letter. The Sandinistas are succeeding in their revolution. They got the support of Mexico, Venezuela. Anti-communist Venezuela is supporting the Sandinistas. Of course, Cuba, but Carter reluctantly acknowledges the Sandinistas. And as Mateo Jarquin has so persuasively demonstrated in his new book, The Sandinista Revolution. So they were demonstrating in neighboring Nicaragua that revolutionary could help an oppressed people to liberate themselves. But as Mateo Jarquin suggests, the revolutionary violence that brought the Sandinistas to power likely also generated the version of Daniel Ortega that we now have in one of the most oppressive autocracies in the Americas. Okay, Leo Guardado's chapter brings that, sorry guys. All right, this is a mind-blowingly interesting chapter that I think brings together so many of the themes of this book. Moral imagination, redistribution of the sensible through disagreement. Guardado argues that the occupations of the cathedral taught Romero the responsibility of the church. He puts it this way: the lack of access to the basic means for belonging in a democratic society is in fact how Romero wanted his hearers to understand the occupation of the cathedral. Here, the part that has no part makes itself visible, insists that it be seen and heard. The excluded part insists that its words are meaningful, and moreover, that the authorities, the large landholders, and even the bishop, Romero's fellow bishops, could understand their words. In this reading of the occupations of the church, we would then say that the occupiers redistributed what could be seen, said, and done. They created a new aesthesis, to use Casarella's word, one that broke with the prior rules for who could do what in the cathedral, and then contributed to the construction of a moral imagination that was better calibrated to the demands the gospel makes on both the excluded and on those who already have power. I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kevin Coleman, for your just thoughtful synthesis to really take us through the text and its many contributions. We now turn to José Henríquez, who's been invited into the conversation. And of course, I'll give you any time you want to offer a rebuttal if you like, to veer from the script. But José joins us. He's completing a PhD in international human rights law at the Irish Centre for Human Rights, University of Galway, where he's been teaching about children's rights and regional systems and mechanisms of human rights protection. He studies the complexities and ramifications of urban violence, mainly when it involves youth in marginalized communities and governmental responses. He's also interested in nonviolence and nonviolent praxis, and actively collaborated to set up the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative for Pax Christi International. His research examines violent dynamics of gangs and states in Central America, and particularly violence against women and girls in several geographical regions. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you again, Todd, for inviting me to be part of this project. And thank you to the whole Notre Dame team for working so hard on this. It's an excellent experience, and I'm very grateful. Thank you, Megan and Kevin, we have been sharing a little bit about this. And you are right, I'm not going to discuss Kevin's statements. No, we were talking about just parentheses. We're talking about that, and I guess it's you may have different readings on Romero, and it's too presumptuous to say that one can have the truth about Romero. But I think that it's yeah, we can keep the conversation of that. As for Megan, my experience of the book project has been also amazing, a great experience, a lot of learning. I am probably the only non-professional theologian in the volume. Although I'm Salvadorian, I have lived there for a long time, and I have been working with rural communities in Central America. So I think that my experience of Romero is also part of being part of the the region. I just want to make a couple notes. One on a topic that I addressed in my chapter, and then some ideas on dissemination, which are to be important. These are rather notes and not finished statements. First, I want to share a few thoughts on Romero and his witness as a Christian and a bishop in dialogue. Why? Because the book has been for me and is still a space for dialogue on many topics concerning Romero, the Salvadorian people, the oppressed of the world, and the poor. Second, because today, it's a special day. It's a Romero Day, which has become also an international day concerning human rights. And then because I recently returned to El Salvador after living abroad for a long time, and my first impression is that the space for dialogue is non-existent at this time. You can argue that it's not only an experience in El Salvador, but it's pretty significant there. It's not that there's no space for dialogue, and that's why I want to address dialogue. That's the same way I did in the chapter. But there's fear. There's fear, and fear is never the right accompaniment to the reality of a state or the people in a society. So I think that the practice of Romero sheds light on how to create spaces for dialogue, even in very complex situations. I wrote in the book about Romero's dialogical praxis, one of his most special characteristics as a peace builder, in how he pushed forward a nonviolent moral imagination to transcend violence in El Salvador, which is seemingly counter-argued, and again, it's different readings. I think that Romero embodied a Salvadorian church in dialogue within a complex, dynamic, and valid context, something that didn't happen to such extent in the past. And if you're familiar with the Latin American church, it hasn't a particular or a characteristic of the Latin American church before the Second Vatican Council. I think that although not all members of the hierarchy accepted the archbishop's praxis, most of the faithful, the poor, the oppressed communities saw in Romero the good shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep, as the gospel reminds us. Romero's dialogue and pastoral care were shaped by Catholic social teaching, the theological development of the Latin American church those years, and through the practice of the Christian-based communities. But not only, but also the oppressed individuals and communities who, even if they were not considered Catholics or part of the church, they were looking for Romero as a voice that could validate, as someone was expressing this afternoon, their own suffering. Romero developed a deep listening capacity for the people of God and the poor and the oppressed. And when he was shaping his homilies, he listened to the poor, he felt the suffering of the poor as his own, and then, and I quote, he denounced the forces of sin in the name of God and in the name of the suffering people. In his homily of March 23rd in 1980, he said, "As I listen all during the week to the cries of the people, and behold, so much horrible crime and shameful violence, I ask the Lord to give me appropriate words for consoling, for denouncing, and for calling to repentance. I have a question, and I wrote about that, but then it's the question I ask in myself in the context of El Salvador, which is not only about El Salvador. The spaces for dialogue are shrinking here in the US, are shrinking in other areas of the world. How you decide the sort of a people like Palestinians or Gazans just without any participation or of the sorts. So is Romero's dialogical praxis alive or even possible? I don't think there's an easy answer. And I don't think the Salvadorian church or the Latin American church in general is going in that direction. I don't think Romero was the standard practice of the bishops of El Salvador. And it's still not a standard practice, I think. I acknowledge that, for instance, last December, the Episcopal Conference of El Salvador issued a pronouncement against mining, expressing its concern about the possible resuming of mining exploitation and its consequences for public health and environment. And the same way they had advocated for that a few years ago. 2 weeks ago, they presented 150,000 signatures to the Legislative Assembly asking for the mining law to be derogated. But I don't know if that is enough. I don't think it's never enough. But I don't think that it's, even with the positive of that action, I think that the whole context of the repression, the current repression in El Salvador and in other countries, it's, it doesn't cover the whole situation. So is the praxis alive? I think it's hidden somehow. So it's a challenge. Definitely, it's a challenge for bishops, but it's a challenge for Christian communities. Because I think that if something is clear about theology of liberation these years is we cannot wait for bishops to act. Every Christian is committed to the gospel. So waiting for the bishops to do, I think, it's simply non-practical, to say it one way. So the sensitivity of this dialogue in Romero, I think it's central, and I think we can keep going back to his practice, his learnings, the way he related to the poor and oppressed, and I think we will keep learning, and we will keep enriching our pastoral practices these days. So it's how to create spaces. It's a big challenge. Okay, I would say when we were preparing this panel, we were also asked where are we in relation to Romero studies and what needs additional research. I think, and I will not go into detail, but I think, for instance, that the complexities of the justice system concerning the oppressed and how Romero addressed that in different ways is something that could be further explored, because that keeps being a central part of authoritarian regimes. And it's the reality of El Salvador now. It's incredible how a little country, which is not able to even reach 100% of literacy among its population, is able to build the largest prison in Latin America and fill it and sell spaces to the US. So I think that the justice system and how that within the broader discussion and reflection on the Catholic social teaching and justice could be helpful. Also, I would say the same about the world of workers. Even if, of course, the conditions have changed so much from the original environment and all that, we are living in situations where labor is under or is being treated, or workers are being treated as simple objects. El Salvador is still not able to discuss dignity for workers. El Salvador has been and keeps being an exporter of people. And the people living in El Salvador are not the elites or the wealthy people. El Salvador exports poor people. Of course, we can discuss that, but I think that revisiting the Catholic social teaching on work and work in the current one last, probably it's a little bit a stretch, but Rafael Moreno Villa, a Jesuit, states that Romero was a visionary who knew how to occasionally glimpse what Pope Francis has promoted about integral ecology. So I think that that's the times we're living. That could be another topic, Romero and ecological justice, to reflect upon and to see how he can also, or his experience and teachings can give us some light in the times we live. Finally, some notes about production, publication, dissemination, and distribution of future studies about Romero. As I totally agree, it has been a great project. It's a great publication. It's a needed publication. And we must find out how to share the published reflections with an audience as broadly as possible. One of the most straightforward answers is, and you mentioned it, is to translate the book into Spanish or other languages for that sake. I know Todd is working on that. So, but I guess that it goes much further. And a little digression here. As we work on this project, I realized that many of the excellent works produced by the contributors of the book are only in English. So you are not allowing people in many spaces to read your findings and to create additional reflection. Just saying, close parentheses. Future research could aspire to broader and more horizontal collaboration between researchers from the global north and south. I don't think it's about Romero studies. I think it's about academia in general. It's about the uneven power in the international arena on how the North and the South interact in general. I know traditionally we can have argued that languages or the cost of publications were a problem, but I think technology is showing us that it's not such a problem these days. So researchers and institutions can be more creative. I know there's no money. That's why creativity is needed. Another issue is that we all recognize the international and interinstitutional collaboration on the research of Romero. Much more can be done. But let me just mention a few, because I think they have been great promoters of Romero's reflection across the globe. You know, the UCA in El Salvador, and the Jesuit community in El Salvador. Other universities as well, of course, like here in the US, the Romero Trust in the UK, CAFOD and other international agencies have made the research so far visible in a very significant way. There's also the contribution of other networks, such as SIGSAL, that you've heard of course. In fact, SIGSAL has a specific objective to spread the spirituality of Monsignor Romero to enrich and guide their solidarity commitment. And SIGSAL is made of many community-based groups around the world. There's Koinonia services and others. But again, I sustain much more can be done. Also, this is very important to me. Future studies should also promote and facilitate co-production between researchers and grassroots Christian communities. I think that even in many ways, Romero's life and message has been reread and interpreted by many voices in these 45 years, and it's a gift. academic theological reflection has been preeminent. And the reflection done by the poor or with the poor has had less space, diffusion, and relevance. And of course, visibility. Perhaps in the current situation of the suffering of the people of God in El Salvador and in the world, reflecting, meditating, enacting, taking Romero's teachings by the hand and together with other hands of the poor could help to increase the hope of the poorest and most oppressed communities, the favorites of Romero. Future studies, I think, could also promote and facilitate multiple expressions related to Romero's legacy. A lot of the work, existing work, is very academic, very rational, very theoretical, but perhaps visual arts, music, poetry has been given less space, less development, may have been neglected or even forgotten. And finally, future studies and collaborations should sharpen their creativity to help involve and engage younger generations with Romero's legacy. Someone this morning called some of the academics studying Romero in the past abuelitos, the grandparents, or just abuelos, right? And so, but if we have abuelos, we also need nietos and nietas and grandchildren. So, Romero tells a story in his homily of November 26, 1978. He writes that a young girl in a visit said to him, "Allow us, children and young people, to greet you as a good friend." And he writes, "You have not said a nicer word to me. I want to be your friend." Romero's words. Seeing how many young people are involved around the Monsignor Romero Center at the UCA in El Salvador is inspiring to me. And I also found inspiring to see how many young people attended the conference on Romero held at the National University of El Salvador just last Friday. So educating the new generations and bringing Romero's legacy closer to them is necessary. I think because without careful and effective sharing, there is a possibility that they will come to consider him, and I quote Elaine Friedman, she wrote in the Revista Envío from Nicaragua in 2015 on the occasion of the beatification. She wrote, and people could consider him an ahistorical and decontextualized image, far from the Saint Romero of America, which you know the expression, of the Salvadoran people who still yearn for its liberation.
Thank you. All right, Coleman. So Jose has taken us to the very conclusion of our time here. But before we conclude, I forgot to mention the most important thing, which is you can find a copy of this book published by University of Notre Dame Press right outside to your right. So find it there. Also, one more announcement. We have a mass to honor and to commemorate Archbishop Romero here at in the Jenkins Nanovic Hall, right just across from the Hasburg Center. That begins at 5:15. So about 45 minutes. Or is that, are we at? Yeah, 45 minutes. Just thanks again to the panelists for your many insights here to the text, and also a thank you to our editor, Todd Walatka, for putting this together. Yeah.